Now, in chapter 3 of Ephesians, Paul talks about his imprisonment. And I want to start off by asking a question. Do you know anyone who's in jail? Or do you know anyone who was in jail? Do you know what that experience is like? I have friends who have been in jail. I myself have never been in jail. But from what they tell me, it's a life-altering experience. You're locked up now. Since we're in this pandemic, it would seem like we are in jail. But when you talk about real jail, that's totally different. So imagine someone taking away your freedom, someone deciding that your freedom is not good enough. I'm about to switch over, by the way, to what we're going to be studying. Your freedom isn't good enough. Your freedom is theirs now. They tell you where to eat, where to sleep. And I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, isn't that like living with my parents? Well, I guess if you think with your parents are in jail, yes. But this is different. These are people who don't love you, the only reason that you exist is for them to keep you captive. So, what do you think that's like? How does that affect your mentality? I want you to think about that as we first read the scriptures, Ephesians 3, 1 through 13, and then we will watch a film where N.T. Wright talks about how that experience may have shaped Paul's theology. But kids, you got to keep it down. Sorry. I'm at my house, so my kids are here. But let's turn on this.
It's because of all this that I, Paul, the prisoner of King Jesus on behalf of...
What the heck is this? I'm going to try it at a lower resolution. Hopefully this will work better.
Of you Gentiles, I'm assuming by the way that you've heard about the plan of God's grace that was given to me to pass on to you. You know, the secret purpose that God revealed to me, as I wrote briefly just now. Anyway, when you read this, you'll be able to understand the special insight I have into the King's secret. This wasn't made known to human beings in previous generations, but now it's been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets. The secret is this, that through the gospel, the Gentiles are to share Israel's inheritance. They are to become fellow members of the body, along with them, and fellow sharers of the promise in King Jesus. This is the gospel that I was appointed to serve, in line with the free gift of God's grace that was given to me. It was backed up with the power through which God accomplishes his work. I am the very least of all God's people. However, he gave me this task as a gift, that I should be the one to tell the Gentiles the good news of the King's wealth no one could begin to count. My job is to make clear to everyone just what the secret plan is, the purpose that's been hidden from the very beginning of the world in God who created all things. And this is it, that God's wisdom in all its rich variety was to be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places through the church. This was God's eternal purpose. He's accomplished it in King Jesus our Lord. We have confidence and access to God in him in full assurance through his faithfulness. So I beg you, don't lose heart because of my sufferings on your behalf. That's your glory.
Okay, so Hopefully that went a little bit better. Oop, hold on, let me pause this before we go to our next session. Okay, so remember how he's framing his imprisonment. You know, what he's doing it for, that he has a purpose for this, that this stuff isn't just happening randomly. Remember earlier in the chapter he talked about being hold on, my wife was texting me. You know, that all of this was part of God's master plan. So I want you to think about that as we are going to listen to N.T. Wright. Okay, so let's continue. I hope this isn't playing, is it? Hold on. Okay, good. All right, so let's see what N.T. Wright has to say about this. I think it'll be okay now because I lowered the resolution.
Paul, as we know, is writing the letter to the Ephesians from prison. And this is a major problem. We may know, because we've been taught it, that Paul was in and out of prison, and we may think, well, that's all different then. Actually, it wasn't. If you've ever known anyone who's been in prison, it's a shame and a scar that they carry with them throughout their lives. Just as I was driving into work this morning, there was a news item about young people who are convicted of certain rather trivial crimes, and about the problem that if, as a young teenager, they get a criminal record, then it can stay with them forever, whereas it may be something which has just happened because of a difficult background and which they need to shake off. In the same way, in Paul's world, somebody who was known to be in prison was a bit dodgy. Maybe the authorities have good reason for not liking him. Maybe we'd not better associate with him so closely. Maybe even the message that he's giving us about God's power and God's love was all a trick anyway, and obviously it doesn't work in his case, otherwise why would he be there? So we can imagine all these things going on in the minds of little Christian communities in places like Laodicea and Hierapolis and Colossae, and in Ephesus itself. Who's this fellow Paul? He's in jail. What's that about? He must be some dangerous character. Thank goodness the authorities caught up with him before he could do any more damage. And Paul says, actually, no. The fact that I'm in prison is part of your glory, because it shows that battle is joined, that something is happening here, as a result of which the world is a different place and the authorities know it. I had a vivid example of this not long ago when I was speaking at a church in one of the republics which was part of the old Soviet Empire, the other side of the Iron Curtain. And we were speaking in a church which you wouldn't have known from the street was a church, because under the old regime, the communist regime, they weren't allowed to have anything on the church that said this is a church, except when you look closely at the door, there was just a very slight carving of loaves and fishes, of symbols which somebody might have known. But then inside, the building went up and then down. The church was quite literally underground. It wasn't allowed to stand up as a church and be seen. I found that fascinating. This great, powerful communist empire, covering 1/3 of the world, was so afraid of the church that it had to say, no, we don't want you to be even seen on the street. It wasn't just that they were trying, of course, to stamp it out. Was that they knew that there was a power latent in the very fact of Christians getting together to worship. And it was a delight to me to be able actually to expound this letter to the Ephesians in that place, and to know that now we were doing so without fear, without the sense that there might be a knock on the door, somebody coming to see what we were up to. Of course, there are then other challenges which face the church in a secular, westernized society, but at least we have the freedom freedom to study. We have the freedom to live out the gospel and to face the new challenges. So Paul is writing to people who may be worried, who may be afraid, who may be ashamed of his suffering and his imprisonment. And as he does so, he explains what his apostolic ministry is all about. Because of this, he says, I, Paul, the prisoner of King Jesus. That's now a title that he wears proudly. And then he says, I'm assuming, by the way, verse 2, he breaks off his train of thought. I'm assuming you do know about.
Sorry, my internet's still a little dodgy. Try to lower it just a little.
The plan of God's grace.
Go back a little bit.
What his apostolic ministry is all about. Because of this, he says, I, Paul, the prisoner of King Jesus. That's now a title that he wears proudly. And then he says, I'm assuming, by the way, verse 2, he breaks off his train of thought. I'm assuming you do know about the plan of God's grace that was given to me to pass on to you. The secret purpose, this is a wonderful word, the word mystery. It occurs many times in the letter to the Galatians. It's a word which both in the ancient pagan world and the ancient Jewish world might well be used as a sign of somebody with secret arcane knowledge. Maybe you have to go through an initiation ceremony and then you become somebody who possesses this mystery. And it's your private spirituality and you're quite proud of it and you sort of enjoy it. For Paul, the mystery is what's been unveiled in the gospel and then entrusted to him. And what is this mystery? The mystery is that God has done a new thing and brought the human race together into a single family, something nobody had ever thought could be done before. Oh, there are hints of it in the Old Testament, bits of it in Isaiah, bits of it in the Psalms. The princes of the people are joined to the people of the God of Abraham, but nobody works out how that'll happen or when it'll happen or what'll have to be done for that to be brought about. Paul says it now has happened, and I, strangely, here in prison, am the one who has been given by God the task of bringing it about. All this is running forward to verse 10, where he talks about God's plan, God's organization. The word he actually uses is oikonomia, from which we get economy, God's grand design of how all things would work together. We'll get back to that in a moment. But this mystery, he says, was previously hidden, but now has been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets. The apostles, ones who saw the risen Christ for themselves and bore witness to it, the prophets, the ones who were inspired to speak God's word into new situations, they are the ones who have been able actually to make these things known. And then Paul, particularly, as one who is both an apostle and a prophet, has the specific commission both to make it happen through his preaching of the gospel and to interpret what it means, so that this is not just an accident. It isn't, well, as some people have said, Paul found that many Jews really didn't like this message, so he gave up on them and went and told it to Gentiles instead. No, the whole point is, in Christ, new creation has been born, has come about. Paul is the one through whom that now seems to be happening. The secret then is this, that through the gospel, the Gentiles, verse 6, are to share Israel's inheritance. It's difficult to say that because many Jews today find that very threatening and dangerous and difficult. We're not saying that the Gentiles take over Israel's inheritance. Many Christians sadly have gone that route. Paul argues strongly against that in Romans chapters 9 to 11. Rather, there is a new entity in which Paul says Israel is fulfilled. This is a place which is a good place for Jews to be. And Gentiles have come into it as well, and all ought to be able to share in this new sense of, instead of sibling rivalry, of a new family unity, family solidarity. That is the vision. So they are to become fellow members of the body, along with the Jews, fellow sharers of the promise. The messianic promise was and remains, of course, a deeply Jewish thing, rooted in the traditions of Israel. But those traditions themselves always said, this is happening in order that the world may come in. So this then is Paul's calling, as he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9 and following, where he says, I am the least of the apostles. I don't deserve to be an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. He seems to be referring to that again here. I am the very least of all God's people. Paul can't come charging in and saying, yes, I was Jesus' right-hand man and he commissioned me to do this, and now I'm carrying on and taking the message out. Paul knows perfectly well that there were other people like Peter and James and John who were very close to Jesus during his earthly life, and Paul has been strangely brought in from the outside as an act of special, extraordinary grace. What on earth was going on? It seems God has a sense of humor, if you like, that when God wants to reach the uncircumcised, the pagan world, the world full of idolatry and immorality, the person he takes to bring the message of grace to them is a hardline Pharisaic Jew, in order, as it were, that nobody could ever turn round and say, well, Paul, you were always a bit soft on the law, weren't you? You never really believed that the Gentiles were that different, so it's been easy for you to do. Paul says, no, absolutely not. I knew Israel's law through and through, Galatians 1. I knew that Jew and Gentile had to be kept separate. But what Paul has seen is that in the death and resurrection of the Messiah, as he's explained in chapter 2, God has done a new thing, killing the enmity and bringing about one new human being in place of the two. And why was God doing this? Paul's task is to announce the king's wealth, he says. Verse 8, I should be the one to tell the Gentiles the good news of the king's wealth. Nobody could count this wealth. Here we have this theme again, the riches that God has available to all who trust in him. And my job, verse 9, is to bring the mystery, the secret plan to light, the purpose that's been hidden from the very beginning of the world. God's aim in creation is now back on track, because the problem of Genesis 3 and Genesis 11, the problem of human idolatry and sin and empire building has been dealt with, and now the purpose which was begun in Genesis 12, that through Abraham and his family all the nations would be blessed, that has at last come about. Here is the purpose, verse 10, that God's wisdom in all its rich variety was to be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places through the church. There's several things about that verse that need unpacking. When Paul talks about the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places, he isn't making a sharp distinction between the people who are actually running the council or the empire or the kingdom, the Caesars and the Herods and the Pilates of this world, and then some spiritual non-bodily forces. For Paul, as for most people in his world, there was a continuum, a sense that actually what we call abstract forces, economic forces, social forces, and so on, that these instantiated themselves in different actual regimes, in different laws, in different human authorities. But there's a toing and froing. You have to see behind the human authorities to the deeper forces which are actually running them. As people have often said, the CEO of General Motors isn't the person who's actually running General Motors. There is a sort of a spirit of General Motors. There's a sense of this is who we are, this is how it all works, which isn't even written down anywhere, but it's driving it forward. Countries, companies, families, local organizations can all go this route. So Paul is saying that the church has something to say to these forces that run the world and squash it into their shape. Is this simply something that the church has to say in words? Actually, no. Everything that Paul has said in chapters 2 and 3 so far indicates that the way the church reveals God's wisdom to the principalities and powers is through its very existence as the united people of God, this extraordinary phenomenon of a new family, which isn't like any other sort of family. There is no other organization in the world that brings together Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female, black and white, and so on. Only through this extraordinary phenomenon can this new family come about. And when that family happens, then the rulers and authorities, even if they are worried about it, are forced to admit there is something going on here which is quite different. And we are confronted with the fact that maybe there is a God. Maybe Jesus is Lord. I remember one time when I was working as a bishop, going to a town which had had major social problems at weekends, as lots of young people, particularly people who didn't have very much money, would crowd into the town on the weekend and go to clubs and pubs where they could have drink and drugs and so on. And the churches had started doing the street pastors scheme, which meant that on Friday and Saturday nights, people from the churches with a prayer backup team would pray and then would go out with high visibility jackets into the clubs and pubs on the streets, not in order to tell the young people they were being stupid or wrong, but in order to be a benign presence, to help people when they were in difficulties, to watch out for petty crime that was going on, to find where people needed to be put in a taxi and sent home rather than staggering home themselves and maybe not finding their way. As a result, the crime rate dropped dramatically every weekend. And I went one night with that team, but before I did, I spoke to the chief of police. The chief of police was an atheist. He wasn't a Christian. He said, I don't know what you guys are up to. He said, but it works. The crime rate has fallen, so whatever it is you're doing, please carry on. And I thought that's exactly Ephesians 3:10, that through the church, the many splendid wisdom of God might be made known to the principalities and powers, both the actual chap who's sitting there in his office running the police, but also the forces that are behind them in society. And this phrase, the many-coloured or many-splendid wisdom of God, God's world, God's wisdom in all its rich variety, that's a phrase which reminds me very much of Psalm 104. Psalm 104 verse 24 says, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yes, because what the church is to show to the world is precisely new creation. And new creation is full of so many wonderful things, just as God's original creation is, only now things which are signs of healing and hope, things which are signs of renewal. This is what we are to reveal to the principalities and powers, and this is the purpose which God had. And so, as we look at the Jewish tradition about the wisdom of God by which the world was made, we can see that Paul has taken that tradition, which was flourishing in his day, and has seen it focused in Jesus, and then going out from Jesus into the creation of a wise human family. Remember in chapter 1, he is praying that people will have wisdom and revelation and insight. They will become genuine human beings, able to think their way into an understanding of what God's plan and purpose is. And notice particularly how throughout this passage, this isn't about us gaining some special spiritual privilege so that we can escape the world and go to heaven. This is about already in the present, us being formed into a community whose very communal life, as well as what we say, and we will say things sooner or later, but whose very communal life and what we do is a sign to the world that God is God, that Jesus is Lord. Paul has already glimpsed that, and he knows that that's why he's in prison, because people find this disruptive, this new force which is let loose in the world. They think their power is under threat, and in a sense it is, but not in the usual way. It's under threat from the very power of love and the new community. And so he says this was God's eternal purpose. He's accomplished it in Jesus. We have confidence and access to God in full assurance through his faithfulness, verse 12. And so therefore, verse 13, don't lose heart on what I'm suffering on your behalf. That is your glory. This is how the purpose is going forward. This isn't a setback. This is a sign, on the contrary, that the gospel is going ahead and the principalities and powers are realizing, whether they want to say it in words or not, that there really is a God and he's the creator, and he is the new creator in and through Jesus the Lord.
Okay. So let's just stop for a minute. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a second. Okay, now remember what he was saying. Why was he in prison? He was in prison because God was manifesting himself through them, through the Ephesians, through what they were doing. And wasn't that a great story, a great example of this church in this town where he was bishop, going into the pubs and the clubs and not telling the kids, hey, you dumb kids, stop drinking. Drinking is bad for you. No, just being a presence. Hey, you need some help going home. Hey, maybe you shouldn't take that. Just being a presence of good. And the crime rate dropped. Now, I want you to juxtapose that to something that happened in the United States, prohibition. What happened when they made drinking illegal? And remember, the original purpose of prohibition, which was driven by women, by the way, who were seeing their husbands, their sons, their brothers get drunk and lose their jobs and get into all kinds of violence. And finally, they had enough of it. They said, if we get rid of drinking, we can get rid of all this crime. But what ended up happening? What ended up happening, crime got even worse because now the mafia got involved and all these criminal organizations got involved. So it was the exact opposite effect because instead of being a presence, they just took away what they perceived as the evil. And for, maybe not really even giving a reason. You just can't drink anymore because I say so. They didn't convince anybody. They just said, we're just taking it away and that's it. But it's much harder what Paul is talking about in Ephesians 3, to be that presence for God, to be the kind of person who is going to be there when your neighbor needs you the most. I remember in the military, my roommate would come home drunk, and he wasn't a Christian, but I would make sure that he was always sleeping on his stomach, because if not, he might throw up and choke. And I remember the day before I left to go back to the States, he said, Omar, I don't know what I'm going to do because you were my guardian angel. And that meant something to me. That meant I was able to make an impression on his life. I was able to show him, even if he didn't agree with me about my Christian life, that my Christian life meant something to him. So, let's continue on. Hope I didn't blather over too much. Let's read the next part of Ephesians, and that is right here, Ephesians 3:14 through 21, and then we'll get into the session.
Because of this, I am kneeling down before the Father, the one who gives the name of family to every family that there is in heaven and on earth. My prayer is this, that he will lay out all the riches of his glory to give you strength and power through his Spirit in your inner being, that the King may make his home in your hearts through faith, that love may be your root, your firm foundation, and that you may be strong enough with all God's holy ones to grasp the breadth and length and height and depth, to know the King's love, though actually it's so deep that nobody can really know it. So may God fill you with all his fullness. So, to the one who is capable of doing far, far more than we can ask or imagine, granted the power which is working in us, to him be glory in the church and in King Jesus, to all generations and to the ages of ages. Amen.
Okay, so let's deconstruct that real quick. But I want you to see the text too. Doesn't really get to look at the text, see? Because I am kneeling down before the Father, the one who gives the name of family to every family that there is in heaven or on earth. So he did, it's funny. I wanted to say this before we start the film. we've been having an argument in our country for years. What is family? What does it mean to be family? Who gets to say who's a family? Are two gay people family? Are three people a family? And God is saying, I'm the one who decides who a family is. I'm the one who gives this nomenclature. And at least from what I'm reading, family is based on love. Because God's family is built on love. Anyway, just wanted to jump in and say that before the professor has his say. So let's see what the professor has to say.
We come now to the short but momentous passage in which Paul draws together everything he's been saying in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. Remember how we said a while back that this isn't about a list of doctrines to be believed. These 3 chapters are themselves an act of worship, almost a liturgical set piece. Because, as we saw in chapter 1, Paul began with a long prayer of blessing, of praise to God, and then from there turned to intercession, and then from there in chapter 2 moved to a description of how people had got onto this map in the first place and what that meant. Then what that meant for Paul himself in his ministry in chapter 3 up to this point. And now he comes back and returns full circle through intercession back to worship again. So chapter 3 verses 14 to 19 is a fresh prayer which Paul is praying for the churches to whom he's writing. And then chapter 3 verses 20 and 21 is simply praising God, coming back to where we were at the beginning. So Paul has introduced himself and his gospel, but he doesn't want to leave it at that. He doesn't want to say, so now all the focus is on me and my suffering and my work. He's needed to explain that to them because many of the people to whom he's writing don't know him personally. They've only heard of him secondhand. And so that was an important thing to do. But now he wants to fold this back again into prayer, into worship. And so he says, I am kneeling before the Father. And this lovely, extraordinary phrase, verse 15, the one who gives the name of family to every family that there is in heaven and on earth. Again, we see the heaven and earth coming together motif there. What does this mean? We sometimes, if we think of God as Father, we may think, well, that's a metaphor from human life, so God is rather like a father. And Paul says, actually, no, it's the other way around. God is the creator. He is the one who gives life to everything that there is. And so all human creation, whether it's an act of paternity or an act of artistry, is in fact a reflection of who God is. We have to learn to see things the other way around, to see our language about God as the ultimate reality, and then our language about ourselves as the metaphors which draw their meaning from what they reflect about God. I suspect there's a huge amount of theological investigation to be done at that point, but that's not for now. We move on. But what he's talking about now is the prayer for what God is going to do, that God will lay out all the riches of his glory. Here we have it again. This is the God who has this treasure house, this storehouse. So many Christians live shrunken lives where they may believe in God, they may be trying to live for him, to do his will, but God seems very remote or seems perhaps somewhat unfriendly or stingy, and they need to know, no, God isn't like that. God is the generous creator. He has all this wealth and riches of glory, and he wants to lay it out for you. And the way it'll come is for an inner transformation to take place. Here is one of the central passages where Paul talks about what happens through the gospel, through the Spirit, when someone comes to believe. His prayer is that God will lay out the riches of his glory to give you strength and power through his Spirit in your inner being. Here we have it again, as in the prayer before, the strength, the power, the energy, the might. What other words have we got for strength and power? God is going to do something inside you which will enable you to do things you couldn't otherwise have done. Sometimes it is very vivid. If you know somebody who has been converted to Christian faith from a life where they were going in completely the opposite direction, often they will speak with surprise of the fact that they can now resist some of the temptations which used to floor them every time, that they can now be generous to people which they never were before. Those of us who grew up in the church and have learned our faith in little bits over many years may not have had such a dramatic transformation, but for all of us, we need to know that this power is available, the power to transform the heart, the mind, the life. That the King, he says, may make his home in your hearts. People often talk about Jesus coming to dwell in your heart, and that is a good biblical picture as we have it here. Sometimes we take that very much in a personal thing, a personal sense, as though Jesus is somehow my private property now. Of course, Jesus is not anybody's private property. And also, this is plural here, that the King may make his home in your hearts, he says to the whole community. Because here's one of the things about the character transformation of the Christian as opposed to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophical traditions of character transformation. In Aristotle and other great philosophers, character transformation is where it's at. This is called virtue. When you decide you want to be a genuine human being, you look at the standard, the ultimate standard of true human happiness, and you practice the character strengths which will enable you to get there. The trouble is, with Aristotle, these character strengths have certain features to do with leading Greek military forces and that sort of thing, and also they are always done solo. This is what you must do to develop your character. But the thing about the Christian character development is it's always a team sport. It's impossible to play this game by yourself because, as he says, you're to be rooted and grounded in love, that love may be your root and your firm foundation. And love, my friends, is something we practice together, isn't it? It's something which we have to be giving and receiving with generosity and humility. And just as in his picture of the temple at the end of chapter 2, he had this idea of the temple as a building, but also the temple as something which was growing like a tree. So here he uses both those systems of language to talk about love. Love is the thing we put our roots down into. The love of God in creation, the love of God in the gospel of Jesus. But love is also the firm foundation, the thing on which we build. The fact that we know that God's love is there, that God's love has achieved what it has achieved in the cross and resurrection of Jesus, means that when we then decide that we are going to take this seriously and become the people that Paul is praying we will become, then we've got this firm foundation on which to build. And then as a result, verse 18, he says that you may be strong enough with all God's holy ones to grasp the breadth and the length and the height and the depth. He's thinking of this amazing panorama which sometimes opens before us of the entire plan of God, the whole biblical narrative and the whole cosmic narrative which it reflects. The more you know about the world, both everything you can see through a telescope and everything you can see through a microscope, the more you know about human beings, so deeply mysterious, so vulnerable and fragile, and yet so beautiful and powerful, the more we discover that it is all one. It's all part of the rich variety of God's wisdom. And Paul says this requires strength to grasp this. It's an interesting point, that it requires a certain character strength to be able to get to the point where you can see that vision and not immediately have your gaze dazzled or distracted by all the other things which will crowd in, whether from in the newspapers or what's going on the street or whatever it may be. It takes a certain strength, a certain kind of prayer to be able to see that big picture and to grasp it and to know the breadth and the length and the height and the depth. He's thinking again of the way in which everything comes together in the gospel, everything comes together in Christ. And particularly, he says, to know the love of the King, the love of the Messiah, though actually he says so deep nobody can really know it. There's something mysterious there about the nature of knowledge itself. Knowledge is a strange thing. People say, do you actually know that it's raining outside, or do you just think it may be? Well, we can find out. We can go outside, stick a hand out, and yep, it's raining. Or no, actually it isn't raining. We say, we know that. But that's a comparatively trivial sort of knowledge. Do you know that Mozart's final 3 symphonies are amazingly beautiful? Well, you can't prove it the way that you can stick your hand out and find out that it's raining. But most people would say, especially anyone with any ear for music, that that sort of knowledge about that beauty is far more important than knowing that it happens or not to be raining. And then beyond even the beauty of music, do you know that this child really loves you? Yes, you can see it in her eyes, in his eyes, in the way they run and jump into your arms. Do you know the power of love? Can you prove that? No, you probably can't. Some psychiatrist might come along with a theory that the child was simply thinking you might give him some nice present or whatever. It may not be real love. But actually, when you really love and are loved, there is a deeper sort of knowing. It passes ordinary knowledge, and that's what Paul is talking about here. To know the love of the King, to know the love of God in and through Jesus the Messiah. And that knowledge takes you beyond anything that you can prove into a realm where, as with love, as with music, don't try to prove it because it's gone way beyond that. To know the unknowable love of God, love of the King. And when that's going on, Paul says, this is God filling you with all his fullness. As he said earlier on, the fullness of the one who fills all in all. The church is the fullness. What is this filling image? There were various philosophical schemes which talked about fullness in one way or another, but I think for Paul this again is a temple image. That when in Exodus chapter 40 the tabernacle was built, constructed finally, this little world, this microcosmos, then the cloud and the fire, the glory came to dwell in it. Read about it in Exodus 40, and then the same thing happening again in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon built the temple, and the cloud of the divine presence came and filled the temple, so that the priests could not even stand to minister before God, because the divine presence was there. And that is the promise again and again. At the end of the book of Ezekiel, in Isaiah 52, in Malachi 3, the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And Paul says that has happened and is happening. The new temple is this community consisting of Jew and Gentile alike who believe in Jesus and who are finding that God is transforming them collectively as well as individually, transforming their hearts through faith. That is where the fullness of God is being made known. So may God fill you with all his fullness, he says. So that the idea of fullness, like the idea of knowledge, is something which Paul is getting from his fronts, the ancient pagan tradition, because when you are putting up a new temple, what you are saying is that the other temples around are redundant. This is actually precisely what we see going on in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus ascends to heaven so that now heaven and earth are joined together in his own body, his own human life. And then in Acts 2, the rushing mighty wind comes from heaven and fills the house where the disciples are sitting. And that's like the coming of the divine presence into the temple. So we shouldn't be surprised that throughout the book of Acts, the major controversies that the church finds itself engaging in, again and again, not absolutely all, but most of them, have to do with temples. The temple in Jerusalem, the pagan shrines in southern Turkey, the big temple in Ephesus, great is Diana of the Ephesians. and the temples in Athens, which Paul then speaks about so powerfully in Acts 17, and then back again to the temple in Jerusalem, and Paul being accused of corrupting it or trying to defile it or whatever, because the whole thing is about, where does the living God dwell? Where is the true temple? And when you say, it's here, it's in this community, these are the people who are being filled with all the fullness of God, then don't be surprised if the principalities and powers take offense, because they thought they had this thing sewn up, and now there is a new reality let loose in the world. And it's because of that new reality that Paul then gives this great paean of praise at the end, verses 20 and 21, picking up the great story of praise which he articulated in chapter 1, verses 3 to 14. To the one who is capable, who is powerful, power again, who can do far, far more than all we can ask or imagine, granted the power that is working. See, Paul can't get away from this notion of power. God has this power. If you doubt it, go back to the resurrection, say that's where the power was displayed, and it's the same power now which is available to transform hearts and lives, to transform communities. And just as our knowledge goes deeper than knowledge itself, because it's rooted in love, so now he says to the one who can do far more than we can ask or imagine. This is the encouragement for Christian prayer. We surely don't need any greater encouragement. It stands in my mind along with those wonderful passages in the Johannine farewell discourses, where Jesus says, anything you ask in my name, I will do it, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. Now, Paul says, granted the power which is working in us, whatever you can ask or imagine, God can do more. I suspect that we in the church have hardly begun to take that seriously. We've allowed the pressures of secularism to shrink us into thinking, well, maybe we can keep our little show going a bit longer, and maybe we can persuade a few more people to join us, or we can plant another church there, but oh dear, things are going wrong over there. No, God has a much greater plan and purpose. And actually, the more we know of the spread of the gospel worldwide, the more we can see that in a measure. Okay, some people from other parts of the world will say, yes, the churches are a mile wide, but they're only an inch deep. I haven't experienced that myself, but I believe what people tell me. But God can make it deeper. God can do new things, and God can revive the churches in the West as well. He's done it before. He can do it again. God's power is capable of doing far more than all we ask or imagine. And so to him be glory. This word again, glory, the living presence of the loving God, living in and with and amongst his people, transforming them, enabling them, so that we glimpse, like people did in Exodus 40 or 1 Kings 8, we glimpse the cloud and the fire, we glimpse the presence of God himself, the God who has made himself known in King Jesus. And unusually, in terms of New Testament blessings, Paul says, to him be glory in the church and in King Jesus, because everything that he's said so far indicates that what God has done in Jesus, he is doing in the church. We need to take that seriously, and we need to say, this is not just a fly-by-night thing. This is going on to all generations and to the ages of ages. It is an extraordinary thing to be caught up in the life of worship and prayer at the heart of the purposes of the Creator God. That's what Paul wants people to grasp in Ephesus, in the surrounding area, and us today.
All right. So let's sum up with just a few questions, and then I want to tie this up. Now, how does Paul use the word Father in reference to God being redefined? Let me ask that again. How does Paul use the word Father as a reference to God, redefine how we understand Father? And what did he say? That sometimes people think of Father as just some guy who may get some other person pregnant and they have a child. But there's a creation aspect of fatherhood. There's a creation aspect that an artist can give birth to something. That's, that fatherhood is not just, someone taking care of a kid, right? So that's something that's important because it kind of takes, when people think about God the Father, there's a lot of baggage attached to that. Well, my father was a jerk, so maybe God's a jerk. But if you look at fatherhood as more of a creation thing, that you are tasked to give birth to something on this earth. What is it going to be? What beautiful thing are you going to create today? That's a totally different way of looking at fatherhood. Now let's go through a couple of these questions because we're almost done here. What, according to Professor Wright, is the difference between character transformation, a Greek philosophical tradition versus a Christian tradition? Why does it matter? Now, remember what he was saying in the Greek tradition. Basically, they encourage change like in the Christian tradition, but it's something that you have to do on your own. You have to make that change. You have to make it happen. A lot of it sounds like the power of positive thinking, doesn't it? I remember when I was I was doing sales, and I used to listen to all kinds of different sales tapes. And a lot of these sales tapes would tell you, you got to make the magic happen. You have to do this. There was a lot of pressure. And then I remember Zig Ziglar talking about some of the same things. He's a sales trainer. He's a great motivational speaker. If you've never heard him, Zig Ziglar. And he was talking about some of the same things, but he also said, it takes all of us to help each other. That you have to give to someone, and then you're going to get everything you want in life. You have to be a giver. You have to share. And this is what Paul's talking about. This is why the two traditions are different, Greek philosophy and Christian. Because in Christian, we're a family. We help create each other into good works. So I just wanted to, there are a lot of other questions, as you can see. But you can, since this is being taped, you can go through them later. But I just wanted to tackle those couple because we're almost done here. Now, next week, I'll just leave this up for a second so you can see it. You can always rewind it and pause it. Now, next week, we're going to be in chapter 4. And let's just get a taste here of chapter 4. Because of this, I am kneeling down. Oh, wait. That's the wrong one. Sorry. Chapter 4. Here we go. 1 through 10. So then, this is my appeal to you. Yes, it's me, the prisoner of the Lord. You must live up to the calling you received. So now, Paul is going to start emphasizing, you need to live up to your calling. You need to love each other. And then he goes into what it means to actually living up to your calling. You need to be who you really are. You need to make manifest what it means to be a Christian. What does that one baptism mean? And again, he's appealing from prison. He's saying, look, I'm in prison and I'm still doing what I have to do. But you're not in prison. So all the more you should be doing even more. Right? So it's an interesting appeal. It's an appeal from weakness because he can't make them do anything because he's in prison. But he's trying to appeal to their conscience. Anyway, we're going to get into this next week. I just wanted you to take a look at it. I'm going to put it right up here. So I'm going to scroll slowly so you can see it. Or maybe I can shrink it a little. Let me see. So I can get the whole thing in. No, I guess not. Anyway, I think this is the whole thing right here. 1 through 9. Yeah, there it is right here. So I'm going to leave it up here. You can always watch it later. But I want you to read it. I want you to think about what it means to living up to your calling. What does it mean to be a real Christian? Does it mean making a set of rules? Does it mean making people like us? What does it mean? And Paul states it very succinctly and very definitively, and we're going to talk about this next week. Anyway, God bless you. This is going to be up on YouTube and on our website soon, so just give me a day or two. I've been trying to get all this stuff up here. Anyway, God bless you. Thank you. If you didn't make the last week's service, it's already up on Facebook. I should have a somewhat cleaned up version of it on YouTube soon and on our website. Next week, we're going to talk about grace and mercy. And it's a passage from Exodus, one of my favorite passages. This is next Sunday. To either tune in or come in person. It's wonderful. It's about God forgiving his people when they really mess up. And I want you to think about someone in your life who's really messed up and you've never forgiven them. And then just think about that. And then this Sunday, I want you to listen to my sermon and ask yourself, maybe I can find it in my heart to forgive this person. Because look at how much God forgives his people. Anyway, you are loved. God loves you. I love you. Tomorrow we're going to have evening prayer, 3 o'clock, so please show up for that. If you can come to church 9:30, sign up for it. I'm going to create a little event for it on Facebook. Should be up by tomorrow. Sign up for it. If not, just come to Facebook Live and watch it. Now, last week we had an open air service, and some people complained that the fountain was a little loud, and it was. I apologize. But next week we're going to be inside. No blessing of the animals next week. That was last week. So hopefully you can tune in and get yourself a blessing so you can be a blessing. All right? Take care. God bless us. Father Omar Reyes of Christ Episcopal Church, Albertville. You are loved. Love and peace. God bless you.